The sound of shattering glass echoed through the halls that once held centuries of debates, decisions, and democracy itself. Papers scattered across marble floors. Radios cracked with frantic voices. They're inside. Secure the chamber. Protect the members. Behind locked doors, lawmakers huddled, their hands trembling as they clutched phones, whispering final words to loved ones, unsure if they would make it out alive. The cameras captured what no spin could erase. Men draped in Confederate flags marching where only moments before the people's representatives had stood. Police officers, overwhelmed and battered, pressed their bodies against barricades, while the mob surged forward with rage in their eyes and chants that drowned out reason. This was not dissent. This was not democracy. This was an invasion. And yet, even as the world watched, some tried to rewrite it. They called it a protest. They called it a misunderstanding. But every broken window told another story. Every scream from a staffer trapped in the gallery cut through the lies. This was not tourism. This was an attack at the center of it all. Was a man who styled himself as untouchable, the Orange King. With a smirk and a microphone, he had poured gasoline on the fire, telling his followers they were warriors, that the election was stolen, that democracy was theirs to smash if it did, not bend to him. And when the flames rose higher, when the mob erected gallows outside the Capitol, he excused it. He told them he loved them, told them they were special. But history does not lie. The images carved into our national memory cannot be softened by talking points. They are etched in blood, in broken doors, in the haunting silence that fell when democracy itself seemed won. Heart beat away from collapse. The world looked on in disbelief. America, the beacon, the ideal, was under siege from within. And in that moment, every citizen had to confront a question too terrifying to ignore. Was this the end of the American story, or the beginning of its rebirth? Because what unfolded that day was not just a riot, was a test of America's soul. And the true battle, the one that would reveal who we are as a nation, was only just beginning. January 6th was not a single day of chaos. It was a mirror held up to America, forcing us to see who we really are when democracy is under siege. It mattered not just for the damage done in those frantic hours, but because it stripped bare the question that has haunted this nation since its founding. Will the people rule, or will power be seized by the few who cannot accept the will of the many? The stakes were not abstract. They were written on the faces of lawmakers who refused to abandon their duty, swearing that no mob would silence the people's vote. Inside the chamber, there were those who stood firm, who pressed forward even as the smoke of tear gas lingered. In the halls, these were men and women, many from immigrant families, many from communities long excluded, who carried with them the weight of history and the promise of America. They understood that their very presence in Congress was a rebuke to the lie that power belongs only to the privileged few. But outside that chamber, even within it, there were others who minimized, who excused, who whispered that perhaps it wasn't so bad. They smirked at the fear of their colleagues. They downplayed the assault even as the broken glass still crunched underfoot. These voices, louder than truth in the moment, tried to sell America a cheaper story, that democracy could be bargained away, that violence could be rebranded as patriotism, that the crown of legitimacy could still rest on the head of the Orange King. And here lies the danger. If lies shouted loud enough can erase reality, then democracy itself is fragile. If a mob storming the Capitol can be dismissed as mere protest, then every citizen's vote can be erased with the stroke of a narrative. If power can be seized by violence, then America is no different from the empires it once vowed to oppose. That is why January 6th matters. Not as a day locked in history books, but as a warning written in real time. A reminder that democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be defended loudly and without apology against those who would torch it for their own ambition. And yet, the story did not end with shattered windows and trembling voices. The truth, though battered, has a way of clawing its way through the noise. The world would soon see that, for every voice that sought to excuse the attack, there was another voice that rose stronger, clearer, and more determined. Because when democracy is under attack, silence is complicity. In the fight to tell the truth about January 6th, the fight to call it what it was only just beginning. What came next would prove that the lie could never fully erase the reality. It would prove that the Orange King's crown was made of glass, and glass, once shattered, cannot be put back together. And as America braced itself for the fallout, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, those who clung to deception; on the other, those who carried the torch of truth into the darkness. The question was no longer whether January 6th happened. It was whether America had the courage to face it. And the answer, though uncertain, was about to shake the nation to its core. To understand the violence of January 6th, one must first understand the man who lit the fuse. Donald Trump did not appear on that stage in front of his followers as a blank slate. He came as the culmination of years of lies, power grabs, and dog whistles that had trained a movement to worship chaos as truth and division as patriotism. He was not a king born of legitimacy, but the self-anointed Orange King, wrapped, not in dignity, but in the fragile armor of spectacle and grievance. From the very beginning, Trump treated truth as a disposable tool. Whether it was the lie of birtherism, a conspiracy meant to delegitimize the first black president, or the repeated falsehoods about immigrants pouring in as criminals and rapists, he weaponized deceit with surgical precision. Every falsehood was a test. How much could he bend reality before it broke? How far could he push the boundaries before his followers stopped believing? The answer, disturbingly, was that they never stopped. They bent with him. They moved the goalposts. They embraced the fantasy. And in that fantasy, Trump thrived. He was addicted to chaos, intoxicated by the roar of crowds chanting not for democracy but for him. The presidency for Trump was never about service. It was about dominance. Every speech, every tweet, every insult was designed not to unite but to fracture, to remind America that he alone could decide who belonged and who did not. Yet beneath the mask of law and order, he was the architect of lawlessness, promised to be the defender of police. Yet on January 6th, his words placed officers in mortal danger. He claimed to be the guardian of the Constitution, yet he pushed schemes to overturn the very votes that gave that Constitution its legitimacy. He styled himself as a patriot, yet his actions betrayed nothing but hunger for unchecked power. This is the contradiction at the core of the Orange King. Claimed strength, but feared the truth. Projected confidence, but demanded constant flattery. He spoke of democracy, but plotted against it. His was a kingdom built not on stone, but on sand. Shifting lies that required constant reinforcement, endless denial, and perpetual outrage. Consider the racial dog whistles that were never truly whispers. He called for bans on Muslim immigrants, painting faith as a threat. He described nations in Africa and the Caribbean as shithole countries, revealing a worldview that saw whiteness as legitimacy and everything else as disposable. He told armed white supremacists to stand back and stand by, offering them not condemnation but a seat at his table. These were not slips of the tongue. They were invitations. Invitations to violence, to exclusion, to the belief that democracy could be reshaped into an empire where only some citizens counted. And yet, his arrogance blinded him to the truth that history has taught every tyrant power taken through deception cannot endure. The more he lied, the more he had to lie. The more he grasped for control, the more fragile his grip became. By the time the 2020 election arrived, his kingdom of grievance could not withstand the weight of reality. The people spoke, and despite his refusal, the verdict was clear. His reign was over, but Trump could not accept it. To do so would be to admit that his throne had always been counterfeit, so he clung tighter. He summoned his followers with one last demand, that they defend his crown by tearing down the very house of democracy. And they obeyed. It was the final act of a man who never believed in democracy to begin with. January 6th was not born in a vacuum. It was the natural conclusion of years spent teaching millions to mistake loyalty to one man for loyalty to a nation. But every king who builds a throne on lies eventually faces the collapse. Glass crowns cannot withstand the weight of truth forever. And as the Orange King watched his mob storm the Capitol, believing they were carrying out his will, he may have felt untouchable. But history was already etching its verdict. Because kings fall, empires crumble. And what remains is the question of whether the people will rise from the ruin stronger than before. And in that moment, while the Orange King reveled in chaos, others were already preparing to rise. The heroes of this story, the defenders of democracy, were about to show that courage outlasts arrogance every single time. If the story of January 6th was defined by the chaos unleashed by the Orange King, it was also defined by those who refused to let that chaos swallow democracy whole. The heroes of this story were not mythic figures born in marble halls. They were ordinary people who carried extraordinary weight on their shoulders. Capitol officers, Democratic representatives, staffers hidden behind desks, and citizens across the nation who refused to look away. They did not wear crowns. They did not demand loyalty. They stood in defense of something larger than themselves, the fragile, stubborn promise of democracy. Consider the Capitol officers. They were men and women who came to work expecting routine duty, crowd control, traffic, the steady hum of Washington bureaucracy. What they found instead was a battlefield. One officer, the son of immigrants, bled in a stairwell after being crushed by the mob. Another was beaten with an American flag, the very symbol he had sworn to protect. Still another used himself as a human decoy, luring rioters away from senators and representatives to give democracy a chance to breathe. They were not thinking of speeches or cameras. They were thinking of survival, of duty, of the oath they had taken not to a man, but to a constitution. Inside the chamber, staffers locked doors with trembling hands, using furniture to barricade. Against the pounding fists outside, they whispered to one another in the dark, silencing their phones, praying the mob would not find them. Yet even in fear, they acted with purpose, protecting classified documents, hiding electoral ballots, preserving the evidence that democracy had spoken and could not be erased. These were young people, many the first in their families to ever work in government, who now found themselves thrust into history's spotlight. And then there were the lawmakers who refused to yield. Democrats who stood tall, even as gas masks were passed out, even as security urged them to evacuate. They knew that if they abandoned their posts, the mob would not just claim physical ground, it would claim symbolic victory. To remain was dangerous. To continue was defiance. And so they did what those who came before them had always done. They carried on, because democracy demanded it. These heroes were not born in that moment. Their courage was not conjured from thin air. It was forged long before, in lives of sacrifice, in families who believed in the promise of America, even when America did not always believe in them. The immigrant officer who dragged himself back to the line despite broken ribs came from a home where sacrifice was a way of life, where parents worked double shifts so their children could live free. The young staffer crouched beneath a desk was the child of a refugee who had fled authoritarian rule, now defending democracy from the inside. The representatives who stood tall carried the legacies of movements that had been told to wait, to stay quiet, to accept less, and refused. Their stories converged on that day because they understood a truth the mob could never grasp. Democracy is not defended by crowns or thrones, but by people, by sweat, by sacrifice, by the simple act of showing up when it matters most. Their names may not be etched in stone, but their actions carved a place in history that no mob could erase. Think of the weight they carried, every officer holding. The line was holding back not just a mob, but the collapse of trust in America's system. Every staffer shielding ballots was guarding the votes of millions whose voices would otherwise be silenced. Every lawmaker refusing to yield was embodying the defiance of generations who had fought for the right to be heard. This was more than survival. This was guardianship. And yet, even as they acted with courage, they knew the odds. Knew they could lose. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear dictate the outcome. In that sense, their struggle was timeless. It echoed through Selma, through Gettysburg, through every place where ordinary people chose to stand against extraordinary darkness. What makes their heroism even more profound is its quietness. None of them sought the spotlight. None declared themselves saviors. Their bravery was not cinematic in intention. It was real, raw, human, and perhaps that is what made it so powerful. Because while the Orange King demanded adoration, while he built his identity on being larger than life, these heroes showed that true strength lies in humility and service. They carried the weight of democracy itself, and they did not falter. But courage always invites confrontation. And those who stood tall on January 6th would soon face not just the mob outside, but the voices inside who sought to erase their sacrifice with lies. Because if heroes rise in the moment, villains never fade quietly into the background. And as the dust settled from the siege, the clash between truth and denial was about to erupt on the national stage with even greater force. The smoke had barely cleared from the Capitol when the battle for the story began. January 6th was not just an attack on the building, it was an attack on the truth itself. And in the weeks and months that followed, that second battle raged inside hearing rooms, press conferences, and the very halls that had been stormed. Republicans, who once cowered behind barricades, began to twist their words into shields for the mob. They called it legitimate political discourse. They claimed the attackers were simply tourists who got carried away. They spoke of patriots and protests while glossing over the blood spilled on the Capitol steps. It was gaslighting on a national scale, an attempt to scrub the memory of broken doors and battered officers clean from America's conscience. But Democrats and truth-tellers refused to let that lie stand. Representatives who had heard the pounding on the chamber doors reminded their colleagues of the terror they had all shared. Officers who fought hand-to-hand against rioters gave testimony with broken voices and visible scars. They demanded that the country look squarely at what had happened, that it named the violence for what it was. The hearings became a theater of contrast. On one side, deflection and denial. On the other, raw truth spoken through clenched jaws. Each session played out like a clash of realities. Republicans interrupted, shouted down witnesses, accused investigators of partisanship. They questioned the motives of officers, implying weakness where there had been only sacrifice. It was as if they believed that if they spoke loudly enough, the images of shattered windows and Confederate flags in the rotunda would vanish. Democrats countered with persistence. They held up photos of gallows built outside the Capitol. They read aloud the words of Trump's tweets that inflamed the mob, recounted the screams of staffers hiding under desks, the trauma that lingered long after the halls were cleaned. They forced the country to remember, to relive, to reject the lie of discourse and face the truth of insurrection, and the escalation was palpable. Shouting matches erupted as Republican members waved their arms and sneered across the table. Democrats answered with steady voices, unwilling to yield the floor. The clash wasn't just between parties, it was between reality and delusion, between accountability and erasure. Every interruption, every accusation, every attempt to bury the truth was another reminder of how fragile democracy remains when denial takes root. Yet through the noise, something else began to emerge, a sense of inevitability, because lies, no matter how loud, cannot erase the silence of a grieving officer. They cannot mute the images of lawmakers in gas masks. They cannot unbuild the gallows that stood as a monument to treachery. For every shout of denial, there was a testimony that cut deeper. For every spin, there was a photograph that told the unvarnished story. Still, the hearings reached a boiling point. Viewers at home could feel it, the tension building with every exchange, every gaslit claim answered with fact. The room seemed to vibrate with contradiction, with a battle not just over what had happened, but over what kind of nation America would become if the lie won. And then came the moment when the noise was shattered by clarity. The hearings had reached a fever pitch. The air was thick with interruptions, deflections, and shameless attempts to twist reality. Republican members leaned back in their chairs, smirking as if the entire ordeal was a game of political theater. They interrupted officers mid-sentence, barked accusations at witnesses, and repeated the phrase legitimate political discourse, as though saying it enough times could alchemize lies into truth. And then silence. A Democrat rose to speak. Their tone measured, their expression unshaken. The room shifted. The spectacle of shouting dulled as eyes turned to the one person who refused to let the noise drown out reality. The counterattack began, not with anger, but with calm precision. "Let's establish the facts," the hero's voice cut through. They reminded the chamber of the images the world had already seen: rioters smashing windows, officers crushed in doorways, gallows erected under the shadow of the Capitol dome. Each point landed like a strike against the fragile armor of denial. Pauses lingered after each sentence, leaving the lies no oxygen to breathe. Republicans shifted uncomfortably. Some scribbled notes, others looked down, suddenly fascinated by their phones. They had thrived on chaos, but clarity was their kryptonite. The hero's words grew sharper. "You call this discourse? Then tell that to the officer who lost his. I tell that to the families of those who died after defending this very building. Tell that to the staffers who wrote goodbye texts as doors shook and fists pounded to break them down." The words hung heavy in the air, undeniable, refutable. Social media would later loop that moment endlessly, the camera panning across the chamber, catching the blank faces of Trump's loyalists, their bluster evaporating under the weight of truth. Hashtags would ignite within minutes. Hashtag not tourism, hashtag attack on democracy, hashtag Orange King exposed. Clips would rack up millions of views before the day was out. Proof that reality had a way of cutting through noise when delivered with courage. The counterattack grew bolder still. The hero turned directly to the claims of law and order. Trump had so often repeated, "law and order." Voice thundered, "Law and order does not mean smashing officers with flagpoles. Law and order does not mean chanting for the execution of the vice president. Law and order does not mean storming the people's house, because one man could not accept that the people chose differently." The words landed like gavel strikes. Republicans who moments earlier had shouted interruptions now sat in uneasy silence, trapped by the weight of their own contradictions. And then, with a deliberate pause, the hero invoked Trump himself, not as a president, not as a leader, but as the Orange King, a man who demanded loyalty to himself above all else. He told them to march here. He told them to fight like hell. He stood by while the Capitol was under siege, watching it unfold on television, unmoved by the pleas of his own allies to call it off. And when it was over, when the blood was still fresh on these steps, what did he say? He told them he loved them. He told them they were special. The chamber froze. It was no longer about abstractions. It was about a man who had betrayed the oath he swore, who had watched his democracy buckled, and who excused it with the flick of a phrase. The counterattack hit its crescendo. You may choose to excuse him. You may choose to look away. The American people saw it with their own eyes. History is watching. Silence was suffocating. For a brief moment, even the Republican members who had thrived on performance politics could not summon a reply. Their faces betrayed what their mouths would not admit. They had no defense. And then came the mic drop line, the one that would echo across headlines, across social media, across every dinner table where the fight for truth still raged. The hero leaned forward, locking eyes with those who had tried to spin the day into myth. "We're not whitewashing January 6th. It was an attack on democracy. And it was led and excused by the Orange King." The words detonated like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the room. The cameras caught it all, the narrowing eyes of Trump's defenders, the quiet nods of those who had waited months to hear someone name the truth without flinching. Within minutes, the clips spread like wildfire. Millions watched on their phones, in classrooms, in workplaces, on the subway. Comment sections filled with validation and relief. Finally, someone said it. Finally, the lie is over. Late-night hosts built entire monologues around the phrase. Activists painted it on protest signs. Ordinary citizens repeated it at rallies and in conversations, transforming the mic drop into a rallying cry, and the more it spread, the more the Orange King's enablers unraveled. Their talking points sounded hollow, their deflections tired. They could not outshout a phrase that carried the clarity of truth. The fortress of denial they had built was collapsing, brick by brick, under the pressure of one undeniable sentence, because clarity is contagious. And in that moment, the nation remembered something essential. Democracy is not defended by spin or spectacle, but by those willing to speak the truth when it matters most. The counterattack was complete. The lies had been dismantled point by point. The villain had been cornered, stripped of the narrative armor that had protected him for so long. And the truth had been delivered in a way that could never be taken back. But even as the chamber absorbed the blow, and even as social media turned the mic drop into a cultural anthem, one question lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. If the Orange King could excuse an attack on democracy and still hold sway over millions, what would it take to finally end his reign of lies? The answer, and the shockwaves it unleashed, was about to sweep through America in ways no one could ignore. The words had barely left the hero's lips when the chamber erupted. Not in sound, but in silence. The kind of silence that comes when truth slices so cleanly through noise that even the loudest mouths have no reply. But outside those walls, beyond the marble and microphones, the effect was instantaneous. Social media caught fire. Within minutes, hashtags blazed across timelines. Hashtag not WHITUWASHING. Hashtag Orange King. Hashtag attack on democracy. The mic drop line was clipped, shared, and remixed into every possible form. One video looped the phrase against images of shattered Capitol windows, each syllable hitting like a hammer against the glass. Another paired it with the haunting shot of rioters scaling the walls. Their frenzy contrasted with the calm certainty of the words that named them for what they were. Not patriots, not tourists, but attackers. Memes flooded Instagram and Twitter. Cartoons of the Orange King sitting on a crumbling throne spread like wildfire. Captions reminding viewers that every king who builds on lies will fall. TikTok creators lip-synced the line, their voices echoing into millions of screens. Commentators seized the moment. Progressive voices called it the quote of the year, the clearest articulation of what January 6th truly meant. News anchors replayed it at the top of every hour, framing it as a watershed moment in the hearings. Even centrists, long reluctant to pick sides, admitted on air that it was impossible to deny the power of the words. Celebrities added their voices to the chorus. Actors, musicians, athletes posted the clip, often with simple captions, "Say it louder, say it everywhere." Late-night hosts turned the phrase into both punchline and rallying cry, weaving it into monologues that mixed satire with searing moral clarity. It turns out, one host quipped, the Orange King isn't wearing clothes or legitimacy. Laughter rippled through audiences. Underneath was a current of recognition. The truth had been spoken, and it could not be unsaid. The ripple effect stretched further still. New calls for accountability surged across the country. Petitions gained thousands of signatures overnight. Editorial boards urged prosecutors to act, to prove that democracy could not only name the crime but punish it. For every defender of the Orange King who tried to downplay the hearings, 10 more voices rose demanding answers. The tide had shifted, and the lie no longer seemed invincible. And it wasn't just politics, it was culture. Artists painted murals of Capitol officers standing against the mob, with the mic drop line etched above their heads. Poets wove the phrase into verses about resilience and justice. College students chanted it at rallies, their voices blending into a defiant echo of generations before them. In living rooms, at dinner tables, in text threads between family members divided by politics, the line became shorthand for truth itself. The Orange King's enablers scrambled. They appeared on cable news, their brows furrowed, their voices strained, insisting that the hearings were a partisan circus. But their words fell flat. Clips of their denials were instantly ratioed, buried under replies quoting the mic drop. They could not escape it. They could not spin it away, for once. Their strategy of repetition was outmatched by the virality of clarity, and with the cultural pressure came political consequences. Lawmakers who had long sat on the fence felt the ground shifting beneath them. New investigations gained momentum. Subpoenas were issued. Prosecutors, once hesitant, now faced a wave of public demand that could not be ignored. The Orange King himself found the walls closing in, not just from courts of law, but from the court of public opinion, which had turned sharply against him. Had begun as a single statement inside a hearing room, had become a national refrain. And in that refrain was a reminder: democracy is not defended in whispers, but in voices loud enough to echo across generations. But this was more than a viral moment. This was a cultural turning point. 2 hearings or headlines? It had seeped into the fabric of everyday life, into art, humor, debate, and memory. The Orange King's crown had cracked, in every share, every retweet. Every conversation widened the fracture, and yet, even as the momentum built, one question loomed larger than all the rest. Could this cultural tidal wave translate into lasting change? Could truth finally overpower the machinery of denial and impunity? The answer would not be decided in a single clip or a single speech. It would be tested in courtrooms, in elections, in the quiet resilience of citizens refusing to let their voices be silenced. The world was watching. The Orange King was cornered. America stood at the edge of a choice that would define its future. January 6 will forever be remembered as a wound in America's history. A day when the foundation of democracy shook under the weight of betrayal. But it will also be remembered for something else, for what refused to break. In the middle of shattered glass and choking smoke, in the face of mobs chanting for blood, democracy did not collapse. It bent, it bled, but it did not fall. And that truth carries with it a lesson we cannot afford to forget. Because January 6 was more than an attack. It was a mirror, forcing us to confront the depths of hatred, cowardice, and corruption that had been given permission to fester. The Orange King and his enablers wanted us to see chaos as power, lies as truth, and violence as patriotism. But in their attempt to crown falsehood, they revealed something else entirely. That real strength does not come from domination. It comes from resilience. Justice is greater than hate. Courage is greater than cowardice. And truth, though battered, will always outlast the lie. Think of the immigrant officers who stood in those stairwells, their blood staining the marble floors as they fought to hold the line. Think of the young staffers locking doors, clutching one another's hands, refusing to let fear define them. Think of the lawmakers who returned to that chamber, shaken but unbroken, determined to finish the work the mob had tried to stop. Their actions said something more powerful than any speech could. They told us that democracy is not defended in the abstract, it is defended in human hearts. One choice at a time, and here lies the deeper inspiration. Democracy survived that day not by accident, but because ordinary people refused to bend. It was not some distant institution that saved the republic. It was individuals, police officers, custodians, aides, clerks, and elected officials, who decided that the Constitution was worth more than their own comfort, even their own safety. That same courage lives outside the walls of the Capitol. It lives in every voter who refuses to be silenced, every organizer who knocks on doors, every citizen who still believes that their voice matters. Democracy is not a fortress guarded only in Washington. It is a living spirit guarded by all of us, every day. And so, as we look back on January 6th, we must resist the temptation to treat it as a closed chapter. The attack may have failed, but the forces that fueled it remain. The Orange King still clings to his lies, and those who excused him still hope to rewrite history. But they cannot erase what the world saw. They cannot erase the courage that answered hate. The moral clarity is undeniable. We are stronger than the storm. Democracy is not the property of the powerful. It belongs to the people. It belongs to the immigrant who swears an oath of service, to the teacher who teaches history honestly, to the worker who takes time off to cast a ballot. It belongs to you. That is the resolution of January 6th. Not despair, not defeat, but resilience. Out of violence came proof of what America can be when its people refused to yield. Out of lies came a rebirth of truth, spoken plainly for all to hear. And out of fear came a call to action, reminding us that the struggle for democracy is never over, but always worth fighting for. So let us carry this forward. Let us remember that every generation is tested, and ours was tested on that day. Though the Orange King tried to drag us into darkness, the light held. The question now is not whether democracy can survive. It already has. The question is whether we, as citizens, will nurture that survival into renewal. Because the story of January 6th is not just theirs, it is ours. And it is not finished. We remember January 6th not to dwell on the past, but to guard the future. Because what happened that day was not a misunderstanding, not a protest gone wrong. It was an attack on democracy itself, led and excused by the Orange King. To whitewash it would be to surrender the truth. To stay silent would be to betray the sacrifices of those who stood in the breach. But here is the hope. America has faced darkness before.
How?
And every time light has broken through. January 6th did not end democracy.
Ow.
It proved that democracy can only die if we, the people, allow it. And we will not. So now the responsibility is ours. It belongs to every one of us who believes that truth matters more than lies, that courage outweighs cowardice, and that justice will always be greater than hate. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It depends on voices like yours, if you believe. Democracy is worth fighting for? Share this story. Subscribe to this channel. Stand with us. Because silence only helps the liars, and apathy only serves the corrupt. Your voice, your vote, your story, they matter. Together, they form the shield that no mob can break and no king can corrupt. This is not the end of the fight. It is the beginning of the next chapter. A chapter written not by those who stormed the Capitol, but by those who defend it with truth, dignity, and resilience. History is watching. So are we.